Racist woman calls police on black teen, regrets it instantly when his FBI chief mom arrives. The streets of Riverton were alive with the hum of weekend activity, families strolling through parks, children darting between food vendors, and couples sipping lattes outside cozy cafes. The warm afternoon sun bathed the town in a golden glow, making it look like something out of a postcard. But for Malik Anderson, today wasn't just another Saturday. Today, he was on a mission. He had spent the past 6 months saving up for this moment. Between school, homework, and basketball practice, he had been working shifts at Joe's coffee house, carefully setting aside every tip and paycheck. It hadn't been easy, especially with balancing everything else in his life, but it was worth it. Because today, he was finally going to buy the perfect birthday gift for his little sister, Zoe. Ever since she was little, Zoe had dreamed of owning a charm bracelet, one of those delicate silver ones with little pendants that jingled with every movement. She had mentioned it in passing, maybe not expecting much, but Malik had been listening. He wanted to see her eyes light up, wanted to surprise her with something she never thought he'd be able to afford. And that's how he found himself standing in front of Bradford's Fine Jewelry, the most upscale jeweler in town. The store was known for its elegance and exclusivity, a place where expensive timepieces and glittering diamonds rested behind thick glass cases, waiting to be admired by those who could afford them. Malik had walked by this store dozens of times before, pressing his nose to the glass just to dream. But today he wasn't just dreaming. He adjusted his hoodie, a simple gray zip-up he had thrown over his neatly pressed polo shirt. He hesitated for just a moment. He knew the way some people looked at him when he walked into stores like this, the way their eyes lingered a little too long, the way their polite smiles never quite reached their eyes. But he shook the thought off. Not today. Taking a deep breath, Malik pushed open the heavy glass door, stepping inside. A soft chime echoed through the store, signaling his entrance. The air inside was cool and perfumed with the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. Rows of display cases sparkled under the bright lighting, each one lined with delicate jewelry that shimmered like stars. Malik felt a rush of excitement. This was it. His eyes scanned the cases, searching for the bracelet he had been eyeing for months. And then, he saw it. A sleek silver chain adorned with tiny, delicate charms, exactly the one he had imagined on Zoe's wrist. A smile tugged at his lips. This was going to be perfect. He didn't notice the shift in the room. Didn't see the way the store clerk, Ellen Bradford, had stiffened behind the counter the moment he walked in. Didn't hear the subtle tightening of her breath or the way her fingers twitched toward the phone. Because for Malik, this was just a normal day. But for Ellen, she had already decided that it wasn't. Malik Anderson was too focused on the bracelet to notice the way the air in the store shifted the moment he walked in. He didn't see how Ellen Bradford, the middle-aged store clerk, had stiffened behind the glass counter, her manicured fingers tightening slightly as she took him in. Ellen had been working at Bradford's Fine Jewelry for years, and in that time, she had developed what she liked to call a good instinct for trouble. It was something her father, the original store owner, had always emphasized. You can tell a lot about people just by looking at them. And now, as she watched Malik, his dark skin, his hoodie, the way he moved through the store alone, her instincts told her something wasn't right. She didn't have any evidence. She didn't need any. Malik had no idea that Ellen had already made up her mind about him before he even reached the display case. She had seen it before, young men like him coming into the store, pretending to shop while scoping the place out. They always had the same look, always had the same act, and she wasn't about to be fooled. Straightening her back, Ellen folded her arms and narrowed her gaze, watching as Malik approached the counter. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral but carrying a sharp undertone. Malik, still caught up in his excitement, didn't register the tension. He simply pointed toward the display, his smile easy and genuine. "Yeah, I'd like to see that bracelet right there," he said. Ellen didn't move. Instead, she studied him, his clothes, his face, the way he clutched his wallet like he was too eager to prove something. "Are you sure?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "That one's quite expensive." Malik's smile faltered slightly. The excitement in his chest dimmed just a little. It was a simple sentence, but the meaning behind it was loud and clear. Still, he kept his voice calm. "I know, I've been saving up for it." Ellen pursed her lips. "Really?" Malik reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, opening it just enough for her to see the neatly folded cash inside. "I have the money right here," he said, his voice steady. Ellen's eyes flicked to the money, but instead of relaxing, she tensed up even more. Something about the sight of it made her lips curl slightly, as if the very idea of him having that much cash was an insult. She didn't reach for the bracelet. Instead, she let out a soft, unimpressed scoff and tilted her head. "And where exactly did you get all that money?" Malik's stomach tightened. He had seen this before. He had felt it before. It was the same look he got when he walked into certain stores, when cashiers took his money a little too slowly, when customers gave him sidelong glances like they were expecting him to do something wrong. He forced himself to breathe through it. "I work at Parker's Coffee House," he said, keeping his voice measured. "Been saving up for months." Ellen hummed, tapping her manicured nails against the counter. "And you expect me to believe that?" Malik's jaw clenched. He wasn't going to lose his temper. "Yes," he said flatly. Ellen let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head like he had just told her the most ridiculous joke she had ever heard. "Well," she sighed dramatically, finally reaching toward the display case, "I suppose I should be flattered that you thought you could fool me." Malik stiffened. "Excuse me?" Ellen pulled out the velvet tray, but instead of gently placing it on the counter like she normally would, she dropped it down carelessly, as if she was already convinced he wasn't worth the effort. "Just be careful with it," she added, her voice turning sharp. "It's worth more than you probably make in a year." Malik's hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, he considered walking away. But then he thought about Zoe's face when she saw the bracelet, the way she would smile, the way she would treasure it forever. So instead, he reached for it. The cool silver felt smooth beneath his fingertips, the tiny charms clinking softly as he turned it in his hands. It was perfect. But just as he shifted his grip, the bracelet slipped. It tumbled toward the counter, bounced once, then slid off the edge, clinking against the tile floor below. Malik's breath caught. Before he could even move to pick it up, Ellen's voice pierced through the store. "Oh my God, I knew it." Malik's stomach dropped. His head snapped up just in time to see Ellen pointing at him, her face twisted with manufactured outrage. "You were trying to steal it," she shouted, her voice carrying through the store. Malik's heart slammed against his ribs. "What?" But Ellen was already reaching for the store phone, her fingers dialing frantically. "Get the police here now," she barked into the receiver. "We've got a thief, young blackmail hoodie, tried to steal from us." Malik felt the air vacuum out of the room. He could see it happening before his eyes, the way customers stiffened, the way their eyes widened with instant judgment. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Wait," he started, stepping back, holding up his hands. "You've got it wrong." Ellen cut him off with a smirk. "I knew you were up to something the moment you walked in," she sneered. And as the distant wail of sirens filled the air, getting closer and closer, Malik felt a cold, sinking realization settle into his bones. She had already decided he was guilty. And now, the rest of the world would believe her too. The bracelet hit the floor with a soft metallic clink, but the sound felt deafening in the silence that followed. Malik Anderson's breath caught in his throat, his fingers frozen in midair. It had been an accident, a simple slip, nothing more. But as soon as he looked up, he knew it didn't matter. Ellen Bradford's face twisted with triumph, her eyes flashing as she pointed at him with a shaking finger. "Oh my God, I knew it!" she shrieked, her voice slicing through the hushed elegance of the store like a blade. Malik's stomach dropped. He barely had time to process what was happening before she lunged for the phone. "Get the police here now," she barked into the receiver. "We've got a thief, young black male, hoodie, tried to steal from us." Malik's pulse pounded against his ribs. "What?" But the moment the words left his mouth, he realized how pointless they were. The entire store had already turned against him. The older woman browsing necklaces near the entrance clutched her purse closer. The man inspecting wedding bands took a careful step back. A couple near the diamond rings whispered to each other, exchanging glances full of silent judgment. It was happening too fast. "Wait, this is a mistake," Malik protested, stepping back with his hands raised. Ellen ignored him entirely. She turned her back as she spoke into the phone, raising her voice just enough to make sure everyone in the store heard. "Yes, I caught him red-handed," she continued, her voice breathless with fabricated outrage. "He tried to pocket an expensive bracelet. Yes, I need officers here immediately." Malik clenched his jaw, his whole body stiff with frustration. This wasn't happening. He had been careful, he had been respectful, he had done everything right, but none of that mattered. The only thing anyone saw was a black teen in a hoodie, standing in a jewelry store where he apparently didn't belong. "I wasn't stealing anything," Malik said, his voice quieter now, but still firm. "The bracelet slipped." Ellen whipped around, her face a mask of righteous fury. "Oh, please," she spat, folding her arms. "You expect me to believe that? That it just happened to fall? That's the oldest trick in the book." Malik's hands curled into fists at his sides. He forced himself to breathe through the heat building in his chest. "Look, the bracelet is right there," he said, pointing to where it lay untouched on the floor. "I never even picked it up. You can check your cameras." Ellen's eyes narrowed. She knew as well as he did that the cameras would prove him right. That's why she wasn't going to check them. Instead, she let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, you're good," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Really good. Trying to act all innocent now, huh? Thought you could play the system? Thought you could get in and out before anyone noticed? Well, guess what? You're not getting away with it." The accusation hit Malik like a punch to the gut. A rush of anger, fear, and disbelief tangled in his chest. "I didn't steal anything." His voice was controlled, but barely. "That's not what I saw," Ellen countered, her voice like nails on glass. The words landed like a hammer. Not what she saw. Not what actually happened. It didn't matter if he was telling the truth. It didn't matter that he had never even touched the bracelet beyond holding it in plain sight. It didn't matter that he had the money in his wallet to pay for it. The only thing that mattered was her word against his. And he already knew who people would believe. The store door swung open suddenly, and the air filled with the sharp wail of approaching sirens. Malik's breath hitched. No. His hands trembled just slightly as he turned toward the entrance. Through the glass windows, he could see the reflection of blaring red and blue lights. The officers weren't even inside the store yet, and already Malik could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. Ellen let out a satisfied sigh, crossing her arms as if she had just won some grand battle. "There, see, they'll sort this out." Malik's chest felt too tight to breathe properly. This was all happening so fast. A uniformed officer stepped inside, his hand resting near his holster as his sharp gaze immediately zeroed in on Malik. Froze. The second officer followed, his expression slightly more hesitant, but his stance still firm. And that was when Ellen spoke again, the final damning words that sealed his fate. "Be careful with him, officers," she warned, her voice low but purposeful. "He's been acting aggressive." Malik's stomach turned to ice. Aggressive. She had just thrown him into a category that could get him killed. And she knew it. Everything in him screamed to run, to protest, to shout the truth. But he didn't move. Because he knew how this played out. One wrong step, one wrong word. And this would end very, very differently. The taller officer took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "Son, put your hands where I can see them." Malik's breath shook. "Wait, just listen. Hands up now." And that was when he knew. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter if he was innocent. The moment he walked through those glass doors, this had been decided for him. He was guilty. Not because of evidence. Not because of truth. Because of who he was. And as the officer reached for his cuffs, Malik did the only thing he could do. He called his mother and prayed she picked up in time. The wail of sirens grew louder, each shrill note carving its way into Malik Anderson's chest like a warning. His breath was shallow, unsteady, his mind racing as the blue and red lights painted the jewelry store in flickering color. The officers hadn't even stepped inside yet, and still Malik could feel their presence closing in, an inevitable force moving with certainty, not caution. The moment the door swung open, 2 officers stepped inside. The first was Officer Greg Sutton, a tall, broad man with graying hair and a hardened expression. His hand hovered near his holster, his eyes locking onto Malik with instant suspicion. The second, Officer Mark Evans, was younger. His stance was tense, but his gaze flickered with uncertainty. Malik barely had time to process their arrival before Ellen Bradford stepped forward, playing her part to perfection. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she gasped dramatically, clutching her chest like she'd just fought off a dangerous criminal. She pointed directly at Malik. "That's him. He tried to steal from me." Malik's stomach plummeted. It wasn't a request for help. It was a declaration, a sentence, a confirmation of his guilt before he had even opened his mouth. Sutton's face hardened instantly. His grip on his belt tightened. He didn't ask Malik a question. He didn't assess the situation. Instead, he took a step forward, already reaching for his cuffs. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them." The words hit Malik like a punch. His whole body locked up. "Wait, just listen. Hands up now." The command was sharper this time, more forceful, less like an order and more like a threat. Malik's fingers twitched at his sides. He wanted to move, to explain, to defend himself. But he knew how this played out. He knew that one wrong move, a flinch, a step, a shift, could turn this moment into something else entirely. So he froze. He lifted his hands slowly, cautiously, like he was walking a tightrope over a pit with no bottom. "I didn't steal anything," he said, his voice controlled, but heavy with the weight of fear. "That's not what she says," Sutton countered coldly. Malik's breath hitched. "Not what she says." That was all it took? Her word against his? Of course it was. Because in this moment, Ellen Bradford was the victim, and he was the suspect. Before Malik could speak again, Sutton grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back with practiced ease. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped shut. A wave of shock, humiliation, and rage crashed into Malik all at once. He had seen this before on the news, in viral videos, in the whispered warnings from his mother. But knowing it could happen and living it were 2 completely different things. "I didn't steal anything," he tried again, his voice shaking now. Ellen let out a mocking scoff. "Oh, please, you really expect them to believe that?" She folded her arms, watching with satisfaction. Officer Evans, who had remained silent up until now, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced toward the display case, where the bracelet still lay on the floor, untouched. For the first time, he hesitated. "Shouldn't we check the security footage?" he asked, looking at Sutton. Sutton's jaw tightened. "We got a 911 call about an attempted robbery, and we have a store owner making a positive ID." He gave Evans a look that shut the conversation down immediately. Malik clenched his teeth. They didn't care about the footage. They didn't care about the truth. They just cared that Ellen had pointed at him and said it was him. And now his hands were locked behind his back. The weight of the cuffs was unbearable, not because they were tight, but because of what they represented. They weren't just chains of steel. They were centuries of history pressing down on him, whispering that nothing had changed. Then, out of instinct, Malik did the only thing he could do. He called his mother. With shaking fingers, he pressed her number and held the phone to his ear. It rang once, twice, then a voice. Malik? His breath hitched. Mom, I need you at Bradford's fine jewelry, now. Sutton scoffed, shaking his head. You can make your call at the station, kid. Malik ignored him. Mom, do you hear me? There was a pause, then a dangerous calm in her voice. I hear you. I'm on my way. Malik closed his eyes. If there was one thing he knew for certain, it was this. His mother wasn't just coming. She was coming to end this. Officer Greg Sutton tightened his grip on Malik Anderson's arm, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. Malik tried to steady his breath, but the humiliation, the fear, the rage, it was all pressing down on him. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, wrists bound like a criminal, judged before he even had a chance to explain. Outside, the sharp screech of tires cut through the thick silence of the jewelry store. The door slammed open. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Every head in the store snapped toward the entrance, and in walked a woman whose presence alone commanded the entire room. Danielle Anderson. She wasn't just Malik's mother. She was the chief of police. Her navy blue blazer was crisp, her badge glinting under the store's bright lights. She moved with a controlled authority, her heels clicking against the polished tile, each step precise, deliberate. But it was her eyes, sharp, unwavering, burning with an intensity that made even the most confident men shrink, that truly set the tone. Malik exhaled slowly. He had seen his mother handle high-stakes situations before, corrupt officials, violent offenders, political scandals. But he had never seen her like this. Deadly calm. She scanned the scene in a matter of seconds, her trained eye absorbing every detail. Her son handcuffed. The store clerk, arms crossed, smirking. Two officers, one avoiding her gaze, the other standing too confidently. She stopped just feet away from Sutton, her expression unreadable. "Sergeant," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "Why is my son in handcuffs?" Sutton's eyes widened slightly. He had clearly expected a concerned mother, not his superior. He straightened his shoulders, but Danielle didn't miss the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Ma'am," he started, choosing his words carefully now. "We received a report of an attempted theft, the store owner." Danielle held up a hand. "Did you check the security footage?" Sutton hesitated. A moment too long. Danielle's eyes narrowed. "I see," she said, her voice dangerously smooth. She turned to Officer Mark Evans, the younger cop, who had shifted uncomfortably the moment she walked in. "Officer Evans, answer me directly." Evans straightened, glancing briefly at Malik, then back to his superior. "No, Chief, we have not reviewed the footage yet." Danielle's lips pressed together, a slow nod as if she expected nothing less. She turned her attention to Ellen Bradford, who was suddenly much quieter than before. "Mrs. Bradford, you called in a report of theft." Ellen squared her shoulders, as if trying to hold on to the control she thought she had. "That's right, Chief. I caught him red-handed. He tried to pocket the bracelet." "Did you see him steal it?" Ellen faltered. I saw him drop it." "Did you see him steal it?" Danielle gave a slow, satisfied nod. She turned back to Sutton, her voice like steel. "Uncuff him, now." Sutton hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, with a reluctant grunt, he reached for his keys. As the cuffs clicked open, Malik let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Danielle turned to him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" she asked quietly. Malik shook his head, not physically. But the emotional toll? That was another story. Danielle understood. Turning back to Sutton, she exhaled sharply. "You're lucky, Sergeant, that this is my son. If it had been someone else's child, this situation could have ended very differently." She turned to Ellen. "And as for you, I sincerely hope your store's security footage tells the exact story you just claimed. Because if it didn't, they would all be answering for it." And she wouldn't let it go. The room was thick with tension as Danielle Anderson turned to the store manager. Her voice was steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "Pull the security footage now." Tom Weaver, the store manager, had been watching from the sidelines, hesitant to get involved. But now, faced with the chief of police's unwavering stare, he had no choice. "Oh, of course, Chief Anderson," he stammered, moving quickly toward the back office. The jewelry store fell into a heavy silence, the only sound being the faint hum of the surveillance system booting up. Ellen Bradford shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence wavering. Sergeant Greg Sutton stood rigid, his jaw clenched. Officer Mark Evans glanced between them all, tension visible in his posture. And then the footage played. The crisp, black-and-white video displayed the exact sequence of events. Malik entering the store, polite and composed, pointing at the bracelet, handing over his money to prove he could afford it. Ellen's dismissive demeanor, her thinly veiled skepticism. Malik holding the bracelet, turning it carefully in his hands. The moment it slipped from his fingers, hitting the glass counter and falling to the floor. And finally, Ellen's exaggerated reaction, her pointing, her shouting, her immediate reach for the phone. Nowhere in the footage was there any attempt to steal. The bracelet had never been hidden in a pocket, never been concealed. There was no crime. A tense silence followed. Danielle exhaled slowly, turning her sharp gaze toward Ellen. "Would you like to explain this?" Ellen's lips parted, but no words came out. Her face had gone pale, her earlier bravado crumbling into something fragile and desperate. Sergeant Sutton ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He wouldn't meet Danielle's eyes. But Officer Evans? He took a step back, his expression shifting from uncertainty to something closer to anger. Danielle turned to Sutton. "Tell me, Sergeant, what exactly was your justification for putting my son in handcuffs?" Sutton hesitated. He had no answer. Danielle took a step forward, her voice lower now, but no less sharp. "You didn't ask questions, you didn't review evidence, you didn't even stop to consider that the person making the accusation might have been lying." She gestured toward the screen. "And now here we are." No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Danielle Anderson stood with her arms crossed, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room. The truth was now undeniable. The security footage had laid it all out. Malik was innocent, and Ellen Bradford had lied. Sergeant Greg Sutton stood stiffly, his face flushed with frustration, not at Ellen, not at himself, but at the fact that he had been proven wrong in front of the chief of police. He had walked into this store ready to arrest a thief. Instead, he had walked into a fabricated story built on bias and assumption. Danielle's voice was calm but firm as she spoke. "Sergeant Sutton, I assume you understand the severity of what just happened here?" Sutton's jaw clenched. "Yes, ma'am." "Then tell me, at what point in your training were you taught to cuff someone before gathering any evidence?" Sutton had no answer. His silence spoke volumes. Danielle turned to Officer Mark Evans, who had been quietly absorbing everything. He had hesitated back in the store. Unlike Sutton, he had questioned whether Malik was guilty. Now his face was tight with discomfort. "Officer Evans," she said, her tone measured, "did you agree with your superior's decision to handcuff my son?" Evans hesitated before answering. "No, ma'am." Sutton's head snapped toward him, his expression unreadable. Evans, to his credit, didn't waver. He looked at Malik, then back at Danielle. "I should have pushed harder to check the footage first, Chief," he admitted. "I won't make that mistake again." Danielle gave him a slow nod. "Good, learn from it." She turned back to Ellen Bradford, whose confidence had been completely stripped away. Ellen had always been used to having control, to making accusations and being believed without question. But now, standing under the scrutiny of the chief of police, her word completely discredited by the security footage, she looked small. Danielle took a slow step toward her. "Mrs. Bradford, you filed a false police report today." Ellen flinched. I thought..." Danielle didn't let her finish. "No, you didn't. You assumed, and that assumption could have destroyed my son's life." Ellen swallowed hard, but she said nothing. Danielle exhaled sharply, turning to Sutton. "Sergeant, I expect a full report on this incident, and I will personally oversee the internal review of your actions today." Sutton gave a stiff nod, knowing full well that this wasn't over. Danielle placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Come on, baby, we're done here." And with that, they walked out, leaving the guilty to deal with the weight of their own choices. The moment Danielle and Malik stepped out of Bradford's fine jewelry, she pulled out her phone. This wasn't over, not even close. Malik exhaled sharply, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been. The air outside felt lighter, but inside, the weight of what just happened still sat heavy in his chest. He had been seconds away from being arrested for absolutely nothing. And if his mother hadn't been who she was, that thought sent a chill through him. Danielle was already moving with purpose, her voice sharp as she spoke into the phone. "Cynthia, I need a statement prepared immediately," she instructed, speaking to her department's media liaison. "We are making it clear that what happened today was unacceptable. I want a full investigation into how this call was handled, why my son was nearly arrested without evidence, and I want the public to know exactly what took place inside that store." Malik's eyes widened slightly. His mother wasn't just filing a complaint. She was going after the entire system that allowed this to happen. Danielle turned to him, her expression softening for a moment. "I know you just want to go home, baby, but I can't let this slide, because if I do, it'll happen to someone else." Malik nodded slowly. He understood. Inside the store, Ellen Bradford was still trying to process what had happened. Her hands shook as she fumbled behind the counter, ignoring the customers who were now whispering about her. "I didn't do anything wrong," she muttered to herself, but the words felt hollow. Because the truth was, she had thought she could get away with it. She had assumed that her word would carry more weight than Malik's. But what she hadn't expected, that he would have someone powerful enough to hold her accountable. Back at the police station, Sutton and Evans were being debriefed on the coming internal investigation. "We'll be reviewing your body cam footage," their lieutenant informed them. "And given the chief's direct involvement, there will be zero tolerance for procedural misconduct." Sutton's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to argue. Evans, on the other hand, felt relief, because today had shown him something he couldn't ignore, that the system he was part of was flawed, and that silence made him complicit. The following morning, the official police statement was released. "Yesterday, an incident involving an unfounded accusation against a minor led to an unjust detainment. Thanks to the intervention of Chief Anderson, justice was swiftly served. However, this event highlights the need for stronger anti-bias training within both law enforcement and the broader community. Effective immediately, new procedures will be implemented to ensure all reports of theft undergo mandatory review of evidence before action is taken." The statement sent shockwaves through the community. Social media erupted, news stations picked up the story, and soon the conversation turned into something bigger than just one wrongful accusation. This was about the larger pattern of racial profiling, how too often people like Malik weren't given the benefit of the doubt. Businesses across Riverton were now being forced to take a hard look at their own policies. For Danielle Anderson, that was only the beginning. Because this wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about making sure it never happened again. Malik sat in his bedroom later that night, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled mess. The adrenaline had long since faded, but the tension in his chest hadn't left. He had thought that once his mother cleared everything up, once the truth came out, he'd feel better. That he'd be able to shake this off, laugh about it one day. But instead, all he felt was exhaustion. He replayed every moment over and over again. The way Ellen Bradford had looked at him the second he walked in, the way her voice had sharpened when she asked about the money in his wallet, the way the police officers had walked in and immediately seen him as a problem to be handled, not a person to be heard. And it didn't matter that he had done everything right. None of it had mattered, because his innocence had never been the point. If his mother hadn't been who she was, what would have happened? Would he have spent the night in a holding cell, his name printed in some local crime report? Would people have whispered about the black kid who got caught stealing from a jewelry store, never bothering to ask if it was true? Would they have even cared? Malik sat up, running a hand over his face. He thought about the other customers in the store. Not one of them had spoken up. Not one of them had questioned Ellen's lie. They had all just stood there, watching. It made him wonder how many other people had been in his exact position. How many of them hadn't been lucky enough to make that one phone call? He exhaled slowly, trying to push the thoughts away, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. Justice had been served, yes. But the fight? The fight was far from over. The next morning, Bradford's fine jewelry sat eerily quiet. The usual hum of high-end clientele browsing sparkling diamonds and luxury watches had been replaced by a heavy silence. Ellen Bradford sat behind the counter, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. The events of the previous day had played out in her mind all night, twisting in circles until she could barely think straight. She had always prided herself on her instincts, on knowing when someone didn't belong, on trusting her gut. But now, her gut had led her straight into a disaster. The moment she saw Chief Danielle Anderson walk through the door, everything changed. Ellen had been so sure of herself when she called the police, so confident in her accusations. She had spoken without hesitation, with absolute certainty. But when the truth was revealed, when the security footage exposed her lie, her world shifted. And yet, here she was, telling herself she had done nothing wrong. She should have apologized. She could have admitted her mistake, acknowledged the truth, owned up to the fact that she had let bias dictate her actions. But instead, she had said nothing. Because Ellen Bradford did not apologize. Not to people like Malik Anderson. Not to a teenager who, in her mind, shouldn't have been in her store to begin with. She had simply stood there, stunned and silent, as Danielle Anderson exposed her for what she was. And when it was all over, when Malik and his mother walked out of the store, leaving her to sit in the wreckage of her own making, she had done what cowards always do. She walked away. No apology, no acknowledgement of the damage she had caused. Because in Ellen's mind, if she didn't say the words, then maybe it wasn't real. Maybe, just maybe, this would all blow over. But deep down she knew better. Because this time, the world was watching.